Chapter 1. His Witness in My Hometown. I was born in the countryside village of Talesh or Tavalesh, located on the western edge of the Caspian Sea in northern Iran, a country which was once the Kingdom of Persia. Geographically, Talesh is the largest territory in the state of Gilan, with high snowy mountain peaks, dark rainy jungles and rice plateaus. It is a beautiful place for those who love nature. The language of the people is Taleshi, which belongs to the Indo-European family of languages. Historians believe Taleshis could be the first Aryans or pre-Aryan nation to inhabit the northern parts of ancient Persia surrounding the Caspian Sea. Taleshis are an agrarian culture whose main source of revenue is farming rice, sheep, and cattle. Rice farmers are found on the plains surrounding the Caspian Sea, while the sheep farmers tend their flocks in the foothills of the mountains to the west. Talesh preserved its own unique culture despite the invasion of Muslim Arabs in the 7th century A.D. There was a great struggle between the Iranian people and invading nomadic Arabic culture. Iranians, including Taleshis, treasure their national heritage and values, which stood in stark contrast to Islamic culture and its religious fundamentalism. From what we know of early Taleshis' religious practices, they did not have any interest in Islam and defended their culture from change for centuries. It was not until the 12th century A.D. that the Safavid dynasty, the kingdom of Iranian Turks or Azeris, forced Islam on Iran or Persia. Iran now may appear to have always been Muslim. However, according to Iranian history, this is not true. Because of pressure from the invading forces and the rise of Islam, Taleshis never used their language in Islamic religious ceremonies. Religious ceremonies, sermons, and mourning were all performed in the Azeri language for Shiites only. The Taleshis' native culture and dress code indicate they never desired to align themselves with Islam. Taleshis adhered to powerful cultural values for thousands of years, despite many invasions. Only Islam created a separation, as some Taleshis are Shiites and some are Sunnis. This segregation was obvious only among committed Muslims. Many Shiite and Sunni Taleshis prized their culture and language far more than the values of Islam, and they lived amicably side by side. Song of the Bulls. Music and song are vital to the culture of my homeland. Taleshis love both music and singing. Music has the ability to move and touch the hearts of all Taleshis. Their love affair with song does not stop at man-made music. It includes the music of nature, birds, and all creatures. This is a blessed legacy inherited from their forefathers and from God. Music is the strongest language among the Taleshis. It is this love and open-heartedness that enables them to hear even the song of a bull or a cuckoo. Yes, Taleshi bulls sing. The word used to describe the song that a bull sings is vang. Vang means to sing in order to get attention. Not only does the singer try to get attention, but there's also a cultural expectation that the hearer heeds the call. They sing with a beautiful, melodious lowing. Some can sing for a full minute. Such a song will bring tears to the eyes of native Taleshis. Perhaps this is reminiscent of a time before man's disastrous fall into sin. Perhaps Adam was able to communicate with animals in a way that is scarcely imaginable now. When a Taleshi bull sings or a cuckoo raises its voice, countrymen sing in response. Jon Brom Jon, or Jon Nanam Jon, or Jon Cuckoo Jon, which means my brother or my mother for a singing cow, or dear cuckoo. I'm ready to give my life for you so that you might be able to live long and sing longer. This does not mean that a person is literally ready to die for a bull or a bird, but it expresses the depth of peaceful unity that such songs inspire. It shows how the soul can be moved by God's creation. Humanity's soul should indeed be moved by God's creation. Some animals seem to understand that there are people who care for their songs. They seem to know that songs can touch the hearts of humanity. They sing to provoke people to sing, and they sing for their masters to receive the best treatment. In Taleshi country, if you hear the song of a bull, you may soon hear the sound of a person's voice responding. This is similar to social gatherings where songs sung and the recitation of poems is often an inspiration for others to sing and recite in response. Masters talk to animals and animals to their masters. They understand each other. As people learn from animals, animals also are sometimes able to learn from people in order to establish a channel of communication to have their needs met. For example, if the master is late in bringing a cow's calf to her, she sings in order to draw his attention. Bulls and cows returning from a day of grazing sing to announce their return or their need for water or more food. If the master is late, many cows will sing in turn or sometimes together, expressing the urgency of their immediate needs. Owners may express empathy with soothing words, saying, What, am I late? Are you hungry or thirsty?" The cow that loses her calf cannot be comforted, crying a song of distress for days in hopes that her owner will return her calf. After days, her lament grows silent. The sensitivity of cows and bulls to blood kept Taleshis from participating in the bloodshed of infidels demanded by the Quran. The bloody revenge of Islam was strange to this nation until the revolution of 1979, when Islamic culture began to penetrate the lives of Iranians. People called themselves Muslims, but their Zoroastrian background was still alive and separated them from the murder and revenge preached by Islam. Before the revolution in 1979, I had never heard of anyone inciting others to take the blood of another as an act of revenge. Blood is a sign of tragedy and loss to Taleshis. Even cows and bulls, like their masters, are afraid of seeing or smelling blood. Even chickens were never killed in a place where cows and bulls might catch the scent, because even the slightest drop of blood would cause the bulls to raise terrified voices of mourning and fear. This cry of the bulls would cause other bulls and cows to join them. Sometimes hundreds, even thousands of bulls and cows would rush from miles away to join in the crying, and the mourning would continue for hours. Such an event would stop all activity in the village dead in its tracks, because no Taleshi could risk losing sight of a family member among thousands of mourning animals. I was amazed to discover that God used faithfulness in animals as an example to open the eyes of mankind. The Bible says that animals know their masters, but people do not know their master, God. An event occurred in my life which caused me to understand the fullness of this message. Animals know their masters well, which can serve the animal or the master either beneficially or to their detriment. For example, if a new master proves to be harsher than the previous owner, bulls and cows have been known to run away to return to more gentle conditions, and a bull who sings the praise of this master will win his favor. I have a story to tell about a bull my father owned. The bull was 3 years old, and at that age a bull matures and begins to search for a mate. A bull's singing voice also matures at this age. A young bull is very territorial and combative, even towards humans, if they feel that a human male is approaching too closely to a cow that the bull has chosen for his mate. This has provoked many attacks on those who are unsuspecting, as my brother found to be painfully true. One day, our bull wandered from our land to the land where his mother came from. The bull was familiar with the man who had originally owned his mother. This man was very kind to animals and loved handsome bulls that had good voices. Our bull had a beautiful voice. All of the men in my family, including my father, were very harsh, not only with people, but also with their animals. Very few men in Taleshi families that I knew were as harsh as the men in my family. My brothers and I emulated our father, who was an angry and bitter man. We never welcomed openness, counseling, or criticism. Women, especially, were prohibited from expressing their opinions in our presence. Even though we were able to feed our animals better than our neighbors were, it was evident that our bull preferred kindness over food. We discovered our bull found a mate from that territory. My older sister, who lived in the area with her husband, saw the bull and passed the information to our family. My older brother got permission from my father to go to the village to retrieve the bull. My brother also had a romantic motive and used the bull as an excuse to see his own girlfriend living in the village. My father warned my brother that he must be careful when approaching the bull, since he was now mature and had discovered a mate. When our bull saw my brother approaching, he sent a quick message through the movement of his body, warning my brother to stay away or risk an attack. As my brother approached the bull, he noticed that his own girlfriend was watching him. My brother wanted to appear brave for her, so he ignored the bull's warning. The bull gored my brother. He was injured severely but survived. My father was so enraged that he sold the bull to a butcher. The bull began to sing his beautiful bull song while tied in the front yard, waiting to leave for slaughter. His voice was so captivating that when my father's friend heard the song, he exclaimed, "You are not going to send this bull with a beautiful voice to the slaughterhouse, are you?" He tried to convince my father that the voice of the bull was like a treasure for the nation, and he must find a way to help the bull to live. He made fun of my father, saying, "You have also acted harshly toward us sometimes. So what should we do with you? Should we get rid of you? You have a beautiful voice too, and because of your beautiful voice, we ignore your harshness." Then, with a serious face, he said to my father, "The problem with this bull is that he is following the tradition of this family. He needs to follow my law. The man, a shepherd, convinced my father to give the bull to him in exchange for a cow and her calf, a generous trade. My father accepted the deal, and the bull lived. The shepherd lived in a mountainous area to the west of our city, about 30 kilometers or 19 miles from our home, and managed to take the bull home with the help of friends and neighbors. To break the angry bull, the shepherd kept him under a yoke all day long for 2 months. He used him to plow the land every day. He also tied the bull in a very small place at night. Gradually, the bull lost muscle tone and became docile. My father was very harsh, but his yoke was easier to bear than the new owner's yoke. Bulls love kind masters with an easy yoke. So one summer night, the bull became weary of the hard work and unkind master. He broke free of his rope and ran, returning to our home. The end of rice sowing season ushers in summer. Taleshis typically move to the mountains during the summer months because the plains become unbearably hot and infested with flies and mosquitoes. Taleshis also take their livestock with them to spare them from the heat and insects. Even if they do not take their animals, the beast will travel to the mountains unguided in order to escape the harsh weather and stinging insects. That summer, we had been unable to travel to the mountains. I do not know why our bull rushed back to the plains during the summer. He certainly could not have known that we were home. In any case, he fled the cooler mountains in his new owner and returned to the hot plains when the mosquitoes were swarming heavily. I suppose he preferred the Taleshi summer plains to the heavy yoke of his new owner. Our bull arrived home in the middle of the night. He must have run all day. He would not have been able to complete the journey simply by walking. His new owner would have discovered that he was missing before he could have completed his 30-kilometer journey. Normally, bulls and cows do not sing at night, but when our bull arrived home, he sang out, waking us all. My father, his 2 wives, my siblings, and I jumped from our beds. "It's our bull," my father cried. My mother confirmed, "Yes, it is he." My father took the lantern and walked toward the gate at the back of our house with 2 wives and 12 children following closely behind. As my father approached the gate, the bull shook his head and exhaled a quick and noisy breath to show he would not attack. My father stretched his hand out over the gate and touched the bull's head, saying, "Oh, my brother," as a sign of his love for the beast. Then he opened the gate as the bull tapped it with his horns. He watched the bull walk through the yard. My father walked behind him, our mothers behind our father, and we children behind our mothers. We followed the bull into the front yard, where he stopped beneath the trees. We were all standing around him, and my father was rubbing the bull's body to welcome him. The bull brought his head down and touched his nose to the ground with a sniff to show my father that he was hungry and needed something to eat. My father fed him. It was then that our family witnessed what amounted to a tearful reconciliation between the bull and my father. This mirrored the reconciliation that occurs between Taleshis when they have wounded one another. This is something very deeply rooted in our culture and filled with emotional symbolism with which I was so familiar. Sometimes I still cannot believe that a beast could touch a human heart so deeply, but I know now that I witnessed God's word come true in that moment. In Taleshi culture, the time of reconciliation is when a victim willingly opens the door to the person who hurts him. Forgiveness is demonstrated by the preparation of a special meal for the offender. This show of love and tender-heartedness causes great remorse in the heart of the malefactor, and sorrow over one's wrongdoing is a tearful affair. These tears are accepted by a victim as a sign of sincere remorse and usually ends in all parties crying and confessing their malevolence. This was exactly what the bull did with my father. While the bull was eating, we witnessed large tears flowing from his eyes. He was shaking his head continually and exhaling noisily, expressing his apology and gentleness toward us. This display of emotion, coupled with his brave nighttime journey down from the mountains, brought the entire family to tears. My father cried gently as he turned his face to my mother and said, "I should not have sold him. His return and kind attitude is a torture to my soul. I'm so glad that I did not send him to the slaughterhouse." I was reminded of the story of our bull once again in 1989, 25 years later while in Turkey. The Iranian Christian preacher that I listened to that day referred to the following verses while teaching about Christ. "Come to me, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Matthew 11:28 and 30. The ox knows his master, but my people do not understand. Isaiah 1:3. In his message, the preacher raised his voice saying, "Even wild and weary bulls understand that kindness is good. They understand which yoke is an easy yoke and which one is not. They and their owners know each other very well. They recognize each other's voices. O God, Do we need to learn from animals in this indifferent, disrespecting, bloodthirsty world? While he spoke, tears flooded my eyes. After the sermon, while church members ate, I was still crying. The preacher came to me with some other Christians to ask why I was crying. I said, "Well, I am a country boy. It is true. I know a wild bull who understood the easy yoke of his owner. I am also that wild bull who now understands what an easy yoke is." They praise God for not leaving a single nation without a witness for His glory. And I was amazed how the words of the people whom Islam calls infidels were relevant to my life, and I could identify myself with them. Music and the silent cry of a toddler. As a young boy, I was a bully. Among all my brothers, I was the most religious but also the angriest. Strangely, though, and contrary to my angry demeanor and hate-filled religious convictions, I was also a very sentimental and emotional boy who craved the loving touch of other people. A small touch and kindness were able to quickly dissolve any walls of anger and bitterness that I built daily around myself. My mother knew my emotional language well. More than any other person in our family, she could always sustain and quiet me with her touch. I was also, and still am, a great lover of music and singing. My love for music, even as a child, was profound. Many times, whenever I would hear music or someone singing, I cried silently so no one would hear me. Once as a toddler, riding on my older sister's back, I heard her singing a native country song as she walked through the garden. I remember resting my head on her shoulder and crying quietly. When my sister realized that I was crying, she put me down, held me in her arms, kissed me, and cried with me, saying, "Oh, my little baby, I'm so sorry. I forgot that you were with me. You love it, don't you? I shouldn't have sung it." My family was amazed and perplexed by my deep affection for music. My silent tears and ruminating at such an early age were somewhat confusing to my mother and siblings. I tend to attribute this emotion to the idea that while safe in my mother's womb, I heard her and others singing or playing music while passing their days working in the fields, tending animals, and preparing meals. Music that cries for help and unity. Taleshis are passionate about their traditional songs. Taleshi music is the nation's classical music. It represents the feelings and emotions of a hard-working and enduring people. The music of the nation has been suppressed, however, throughout the centuries by Islam. The old melodies that remain cry for help and unity. Even though Taleshis are now Muslims, they hold fast to their traditional culture, including music. Their music has helped them to live in unity despite the heavy pressures of Muslim rulers. I believe that many, if not most, Taleshis have become Muslims to placate Muslim rulers. If they profess even a nominal Muslim faith, they are able to protect their cultural values from complete eradication. This is what I witnessed after the Islamic Revolution. The Taleshis were the last tribe to stand faithful to the kingdom of Persia, and still many of them desire that Iran be led by a Persian king, a king who will protect their values and their culture under the democratic creeds proposed long, long ago by Cyrus and Darius, the great Persian rulers. The Islamic Republic of Iran has been so cruel and so vicious to my people, yet it has not been able to completely erase their cultural foundations. Music also plays a vital role in the ritual of courtship. The Taleshi springs and summers are the seasons of poetic and romantic songs. All Taleshi songs are poems. This is a clue that the Taleshi people are an exceedingly romantic people by nature. Young men and women of Talesh normally fall in love in the spring and summer as they seem to do everywhere else in the world. The fascinating melodic beauty of spring and summer excites the senses after long, dreary winters. Eyes sparkle with youthful exuberance while the fresh scent of grass, flowers, hay, and spring rain captures the fragrance of new life. It's an easy time to sing songs and write poems since there is a fresh beauty everywhere. Unfortunately, Islam has limited the ability of lovers to express themselves to one another and has made it nearly impossible for young men and women to know each other before marriage. The degree to which relationships are limited prior to marriage depends largely on whether or not the country is ruled by fundamentalist Muslims or a nominal government body. Rigid Islamic rules make it extremely difficult, even dangerous, for a young woman to have a discussion or even be seen in public alone with a young man who is not a relative. A young woman seen in public with a man that is not her husband or relative can be tortured or stoned to death. Taleshi girls and boys had far more freedom to speak to one another before the Revolution of Iran in 1979, despite the long presence of Islam in the region. Post-Islamic Revolution boys and girls were forced to resort to communicating through body language and eye contact. This was still risky because it broke Islamic law and could pose a serious threat, especially for girls. If a boy and a girl fell in love, the only way for them to see each other was through clandestine meetings if they dared. Islam caused them to keep romantic conversations secret, even from their own families. Young people had to create opportunities and be creative in their excuses as they sought to engage their beloved. They would seek each other out in work situations, work areas, or chance meetings in the street. Being sent to fetch water from the spring was a wonderful opportunity to meet someone, as was going out to collect wild berries. Bumping into someone and pretending to help gather their belongings from off the pavement was also a favorite and relatively safe sport for socializing between young men and women. Many mothers within fundamentalist families realize the pressure placed on their children by Islam and are willing to arrange secret opportunities with friendly families in order to pave the way for their children's future marriages. This is generally not approved by the fathers of such families and can prove to have dire consequences if a father becomes wise to the matchmaking schemes of his wife. The greatest punishment would be reserved for the daughter who would be considered defiled in the eyes of Islam and no longer fit for marriage or even to live. Because of the fear created by Islam, a majority of marriages are arranged by parents. Young couples do not know each other before marriage. If a boy and a girl fall in love with each other, it is typically expected for the girl to express her interest in the boy to her mother directly or indirectly through one of her sisters or female relatives or friends. The mother will then speak to her husband to determine his response. Then she will convey the father's acceptance or rejection. Likewise, the young man will also make his feelings known to his mother, so she in turn can seek his father's approval. If the boy's father favors such a relationship, he will send 2 or more messengers to the girl's father to gain official permission for the young woman's hand in marriage. If the messengers receive a positive response, an engagement ceremony will be arranged at the young woman's family's home, where the dowry will also be established. Several months to a year later, a marriage celebration is held at the boy's father's house. The girl is then taken to reside in the home of the boy's family. Marriage celebrations can last anywhere from 3 to 7 days, depending on the boy's father. Musicians are hired to perform and sing at these celebrations if fundamentalist Muslims are not around. It has not been easy for Islam to impose itself fully on the Iranian people because they're so strongly attached and deeply in love with their Persian heritage. People have learned to take back some of their traditions gradually and secretly to preserve their cultural values despite Islam's contrary demands. The Iranian people's powerful and subversive agendas have exhausted even the most zealous and cruel religious dictators and in some cases forced religious leaders to lighten the hand of oppression. This lightening was not out of compassion, but purely from the Iranian struggle for their cultural rights. Despite 1,400 years of Islamic influence in Persia, no religious leader has been able to stop Iranian people from enjoying music. At the beginning of the revolution, rigid Muslim judges ordered the religious guard to destroy musical instruments. Some were centuries old. However, despite these setbacks and attempts by Islamic extremists to squash music, the love of Iranians for their music persisted. This persistence exhausted even the grand leader Ayatollah Khomeini, and as a result he finally had no choice but to remove some of the restrictions on music. Music is a life force for the Iranian people. Miracle child. I was born into a Muslim family, the 4th out of 8 children from my mother. Before I was born, my parents lost a son. My brother was 2 years old when he died. My family told me he had been a bright boy and very sweet in his disposition. His death affected my parents in ways that only a parent who lost a child can begin to understand. I was given his name when I was born. By the time of my birth, my parents still had not reported my brother's death for reasons known only to them. The government agency that handles such matters was never given the opportunity to cancel my brother's identification booklet. The booklet recorded a birth 2 years prior to mine, but my parents decided to use it for me. They believed my birth was a miracle and God had given them another son to replace the child that had passed on. Before I was born, my mother had already given birth to 4 children. She had a girl first, followed by a boy, then a girl, then a boy. When my mother was carrying me after my brother's death, she was convinced it was a girl. My parents had perceived that my mother would continue to give birth in an alternating fashion, boy, girl, boy, girl. What a big surprise and blessing it was when I arrived as a boy. They believed that God had replaced the boy who died. Child prodigy. From the time I began to speak, my parents knew that I would be a fast learner. I was only 4 when my father enrolled me in primary school, but because of the identification booklet my parents had given to me, I was admitted as a 6-year-old. I attended school with my stepbrother of 6.5 years. Even though I was much younger, I managed my studies and exams far better than he. My stepbrother was really struggling in school, so my father allowed him to quit after 5th grade. As for me, I delighted in the challenges and hard work required to complete homework. I enjoyed pursuing extra studies and would often sit studying late into the night aided by a lantern. I did not have a room or a study where I could tend to my work without disturbing others. I would work quietly in the same room where all of my siblings slept. Despite family and financial difficulties, I earned high grades because of my hard work. This convinced my parents that I was truly a miracle sent by God to console them. It also led them to believe that I would grow up to be a godly man. Many Muslims, including my parents, equate intelligence with godliness because they know that a clever student will potentially be able to memorize the Quran, the holy book of Islam, and this is fundamental for the growth of a religious person. On the other hand, my parents were also keenly aware of my passion for music. This was confusing to them because they also knew that Islamic doctrine considers music to be evil. Why would Allah create a godly man to love that which Allah condemned? It seemed to contradict itself. Because I was doing well in my studies, my parents encouraged me to read and recite the Quran in Arabic, a foreign language to Iranians. By the time I was 9 years old, I was able to read the Quran in Arabic and recite its chapters from memory. People would frequently call on me to recite the Quran at their various religious events and ceremonies. This lifted me up in the eyes of people. Other boys were taunted by their parents for their inability to recite the Quran as I could. Every family desired to have at least one child who could recite the Quran over their grave after their deaths in order to subdue the torments of hell or to receive rewards for their souls from Allah on the Day of Judgment. The lack of a reciter of the Quran at a funeral gathering would bring humiliation to the family members of a deceased person, as no one could be found to recite the Quran for his or her sake. My ability to recite the Quran gained honor for my family members in every respect. It seemed to be a misfortune that as I grew, my eyes became increasingly sensitive to sunlight. I was unable to open my eyes at all in the mornings until I had become properly adjusted to the daylight. My older brother would hold my hand while we made the hour-long walk to school, and it wasn't until we arrived at school that I was able to open my eyes fully. For the first 9 years of my schooling, my family was unable to find a physician who could manage treatment for the problem of my eyes. There were no specialists in our city, and travel costs were prohibitive. Fortunately, by the time I reached 10th grade, I was able to save enough money from jobs I worked in weekends and during holidays to pay for a doctor who could prescribe the proper optical prescription for my condition. 2 families. According to Islam, a man can legally marry up to 4 wives and have as many concubines as he likes. The practice of keeping concubines was not popular in our town, and very few Taleshi men practiced polygamy, but my father had 2 wives and managed to father 12 children between them. My father was married to my mother until 3 years before I was born. He then took another girl as his second wife. My mother could not protest my father's decision to bring a second wife into our family. My father was not a religious man, but he considered himself to be a Sunni. His wives were both Shiites. Traditionally, religious Muslims marry people from their own sect, but because my father was not fundamentally religious, he married whomever he pleased. The fact that Shiites were dominant in our region very likely played a key role in the fact that my father was not particular about what religious sects his wives came from. My mother seemed to be more religious than my father, but she could still pass for a nominal and superstitious Muslim. They did not know Islam and were unable to understand Islamic fundamentalism. There were 2 languages spoken in our home. My father's stepmother and all children of the family spoke to each other in Taleshi, but my father and my mother's children all spoke to my mother in Azeri, the language of my mother's people, the Azerbaijanis. My mother did not know Taleshi when she married my father, but he spoke Azeri and was able to communicate with her in her language. It kept the language in the family. I didn't learn Persian or Farsi, the official language of Iran, until I started school. This is often one of the biggest surprises for people because they do not realize Iran has many different languages. Country living. I grew up in a mud-wood 2-room house that I shared with 11 brothers and sisters and 3 parents. The 2 rooms we shared also connected to something like a veranda. There was a storeroom attached to the house with a summer room above it, only much more primitive. We were forced to sleep there whenever the humid summer months became overbearing. We would all 15 of us sleep on the floor, covered with mosquito nets. Traditional Taleshi homes were made of timber and mud mixed with hay, and the poorest families would have to cover their roofs with rice straw, which is the cheapest material available. The rich and middle-class families covered the roofs of their houses with wooden sheeting, tiles, and sheet metal. Storms would often blow away the hay with which my father thatched our roof, and rain would come pouring down into our house. Our financial difficulties prevented my father from ever fixing our roof properly. On rainy days, we placed all our pots and bowls under the leaking ceiling to keep the rooms as dry as we could. Our family owned a small rice farm, which did not have good soil and sadly never produced enough to feed us. In order to meet our most basic provisions, my mother, stepmother, and older sisters were forced to work on other farms. Having enough food for our family was always a struggle. We often ate rice 3 times a day, with the rice as a side dish that could consist of walnut, yogurt, milk, butter, cheese, egg, vegetable jam, or both homegrown and wild herbs. Sometimes we could afford to have more side dishes with our rice. Rarely could we eat chicken or meat or fish with our rice. Our parents preferred to keep them for the feast days or when we had visitors. During the seasons of sowing and harvesting crops, every family member was expected to work and help. While the adults were out working in the fields, the children would gather firewood, prepare meals for the entire family, and haul water from neighborhood springs or wells. Sometimes we would even take our wares to market to sell or trade so we could buy bread and other staples. I do remember preparing and baking the traditional Taleshi flatbread in a clay oven when I was a very young child. The rice harvest arrives at the end of summer, and the new rice is eaten in celebration with neighbors and friends. A colorful table is prepared with the harvested rice and other wonderful and delicious foods. All of the men ate together in one room and the ladies in another, except when all male and females are close family relatives. In this case, they all have their meal together. The traditional way to begin such a celebration is for the father of the family to touch the cooked new rice and begin eating. This signals the commencement of the festivities wherein all those in attendance are able to partake. When everyone has eaten his fill, each person is expected to leave just a spoonful of food on their plate, signifying a blessing on the family for abundance and more rice than is even needed for the entire year. Many people hold their new rice celebrations in the fall. Some very rich families will wait until winter to celebrate the late summer harvest as a sign of the abundance in their lives. But families like mine, who could not afford to wait for the food, held their celebration in the last month of summer after the harvest. We children were filled with excitement during the rice feast because we could eat plenty. For centuries, Taleshis would move to their mountain homes to wait out the extremely humid and mosquito-infested summer months from the time the rice was planted until harvest. The weather was cool and pleasant in the mountains. No bugs, no humidity, only sweet, cool breezes. Taking part in the mountain retreats was wonderful and sometimes inspirational. While my father was alive, we rarely made the trip. It was only after his death that my family was able to save enough money to enjoy those wonderful mountain retreats. Life with Father. My father, unlike Taleshi men and his hard-working wives and children, was not a working person. He felt that work was only for women and children. He was a dictator, and no one in our home dared to question him. His relationship with the family was like the relationship of a master to his slaves. If he raised his voice, we all had to stand at attention. His best moments were when he had money in his pocket and could go to the bazaar or market to spend time with other men like himself. He spent most of his time in tea houses with other men and spent our family's money in the lotto. He did not disguise his dislike for the feudal class, which earned him respect among his peers. He was also notorious for his fearsome reputation, and even his closest friends were very careful in his company. They knew he could easily turn on them with one wrong word. He loved to have friends, but his nature prevented him from maintaining any good and lasting relationships. Without warning, he could become extremely violent toward any who spoke against him, and it was equally strange and surprising to see him become gentle when someone praised him. He loved to be praised, but was not able to ever tolerate any criticism or opposition. This dualistic personality made him an easy and predictable target for those ready to take advantage of him. The cleverest deceivers were able to empty my father's pocket with the slightest praise. My father's pride ruled him, but it also eventually ruined him. His life was a continual failure because of his confused and complicated mind. With no talent for making money and unable to save, my father lived one day at a time, too busy to be concerned about his and his family's future. He considered manual labor a disgrace and quickly squandered the money his family earned working on other farms. My grandfather and his brothers were rich and prestigious people among the community. My father received a healthy inheritance after the death of my grandfather, but spent it all in a very short time. All that remained was shallow and superficial family prestige. The village community treated my father as an elder because of the legacy that his family left him. My father, however, did not possess the values of prevalent Taleshi-style eldership, nor did he desire them. My father believed that an elder of the community should not work. Working for others reduces the authority of eldership, he believed. A boss must always be a boss. These were not the attitudes of all Taleshi men. Most Taleshi people were hard-working farmers, and for the sake of their families, they preferred helping their families to any kind of eldership. For this reason, they struggled through long days and long nights. My father's hobbies were chickens and an orchard. He loved to have every kind of chicken in the yard, which could be costly whenever diseases were introduced into the yard by other chickens. He also collected all kinds of fruit plants from everywhere and planted them in our orchard. But he was only a collector, leaving the care of the chickens in the orchard to the family. If we lost a chicken to a fox or a jackal, or a plant was broken by an animal, then it was woe to the family. His graceless attitudes caused us to take refuge in lying sometimes and rescue ourselves from his attacks. One day, on a school holiday, we 3 brothers were asked to look after the house and watch our birds. We lost several of our ducks to a fox that day. We knew that our father would punish us harshly. We were trying to find a way to escape his punishment. Our plan worked. I was instructed by my older brother to take the blame and sit by the main road 100 yards far from our house. I was to cry hard as soon as I saw our father coming from the bazaar. My cry, we thought, may scare him and soften his heart toward us. Our middle brother took the responsibility to hide outside the house and watch our father's reaction and report it to the older brother. If he was furious, then my brothers could run away and hide. Long story short, I saw my father coming from a mile away. I started to cry naturally because of my fear. When father got closer to me, I sobbed so hard I almost fainted. This scared my father to death, thinking that something really horrible may have happened to the family. He was nervous and continually asked what happened, but I could not speak clearly because of my sobbing. Eventually, I was able to inform him that a fox had left a few of our ducks dead in the orchard and taken others. He sighed a breath of relief when he heard this and said something unbelievable. "For the death of a few birds you are terrified and terrifying me? I don't care about them." He then lifted me up from the dust and walked me to the house. When the middle brother saw him, he also started to cry. Then my father left to calm him down. As he was talking to my middle brother, I rushed home and gave the good news to the older brothers that our father was not angry. The older brother also started to cry when he saw father. His words to the older brother were nice also. We were happy to escape his punishment that day. We kept that day a secret until our father's death. After that, it became a source of laughter in the family. My father was not religious, nor was he against religion, but he did not like religious clerics or mullahs. He believed they talked about moral standards that they themselves were unable to follow. Unlike many Taleshis, he did not like the ruling king because the middle class and poor were unable to stand for their rights against the rich. He was openly critical of the mullahs because mullahs were not in power at that time, but he refrained from openly criticizing the king for fear of endangering his own life. My father had his own ideas. According to my father, women needed no education, and he did not like the idea of freedom for women, a belief which placed him in direct opposition to the king of Iran. Though he was a dictator to us, and especially to his wives, he also knew that a wife could take her husband to a court for his unjust treatments. For this reason, we sometimes saw fear in his face when he was harsh. Strangely, my father would never tolerate even the slightest injustice toward his family from others, all the while inflicting extremely harsh treatment on us. And true to his bizarre inconsistencies and erratic behavior, my father was still always very generous to the needy. Home sweet home. I never heard of a man with more than one wife also having a peaceful home. The two mothers in our home always worked very hard, but were never happy to share life with each other. Any time they had an opportunity to ignore one another or one another's children, they would do it. This subversive behavior was kept secret from my father, who would never tolerate discord between the two wives and their children. If my father discovered such discrimination, he would make their lives very difficult. Sometimes problems would escalate between the two women to such a degree that my father's reactions were treated with indifference. Eventually, it seemed that my mother and stepmother had given up any hope concerning their futures and personal desires. So my father's rebukes soon became commonplace and irrelevant to them, allowing them to practice their pettiness toward each other more openly as the years passed. I never heard them express any wishes for themselves or their futures, but only that their children would grow safely and that they would each find their way to a good future that was different from the lives they were living. They did and were ready to do everything for their children in order to see them moving ahead. The life of the girls of our family was not promising at all. They were pressured by my father to marry men whom they did not like. Girls got married at a young age since my father was able to receive their dowries. However, he was in no hurry for his sons to marry because he had to pay a dowry. Aim high. Every day was a struggle for my family. My father's expectation for his sons was to graduate from 9th grade, find a job, and make money so he could continue his leisurely lifestyle. I worked hard to earn money to bribe him to allow me to continue my schooling. It was my clever capitalist mentality that convinced my father that I could be both a good student and an excellent moneymaker. When I received good marks, I would spread the news among our family and the community in order to bring honor to my family and draw his attention to me. Bringing honor to my father was another way of making him happy. I labored very hard under the certainty that a higher education would guarantee a good job with substantial income, and that I would also be elevating myself socially and politically. My desire was to make a better life for my family. The one thing that always threatened the study of many native Taleshi children was the high cost of education and the inability of families to pay for it. Because of these obstacles, many Taleshis were satisfied if their children learned only the basics of reading and writing. Students who pursued higher education had to find a way to earn enough income to finance their education and also to help their families. This measure was taken to ensure that a student remained in his parents' favor. Otherwise, the student might be forced to return home to continue laboring. Lifestyle differences between the city and villages also created obstacles for us country students to continue school. Wealthy urban citizens who were not natives, including many teachers and students, viewed villagers as less civilized or retarded. Some teachers would taunt lazy students from the city, calling them villagers. This kind of discrimination was common. If a student struggled, people would say, "Are you a villager? Have you come from a mountain?" Even though many of us were excellent students, some teachers were convinced that we would not succeed. It was common for individuals from rural areas to feel the sting of discrimination in the cities. I believe that the disdain that many city dwellers poured on country people caused them to isolate themselves from city life. This certainly helped to perpetuate the lack of education in villages and agricultural communities. Some students would go so far as to avoid associating with their families, who would sometimes go to the city to shop, all for the sake of appearing civilized. I would often ask myself, if I finish school and live in the city, will I be able to marry a girl from the city? and still retain my family ties? Would my spouse tolerate the life that my siblings and parents lived? And would she be interested in knowing them? It was difficult to believe that this could ever be a reality, so I did everything in my power to avoid confronting that issue. I decided that I would wait until I graduated to concern myself with relationships, even though I wanted so much to be married. I was especially careful to avoid city girls because I knew that I would have to navigate social obstacles. There were many times when I responded negatively toward girls who I really liked just to avoid having to deal with the possibility that they might reject my family, a possibility that was unbearable to me. One day in the university library, I saw the most beautiful girl I had ever seen in my life. I couldn't take my eyes off of her. She was so lovely, and I couldn't believe that she was looking at me. Because she didn't look away when our eyes met, I knew that she wanted to talk to me. The thought of such a beauty desiring my attention was captivating and exciting. I wanted so much to know her, but everything about her told me that she was not only a city girl, but she was from an affluent family. I couldn't tear my thoughts away from my family, and I couldn't escape the fact that there were too many factors working against any hope for me ever being with her. This attitude is difficult for many contemporary Westerners to understand because they believe that social barriers are not barriers at all. But in the Middle East, these are walls that are virtually insurmountable. I decided to ignore the lady. My lack of attention to her did not discourage her. One day, she just sat right down next to me in the library and asked me the time. I thought it would be fun to tease her and make fun of her, so I gently took her hand and read the time from the watch on her wrist. She was so embarrassed, she quickly gathered her belongings to leave, but as she left, I saw love in her eyes. Watching her leave was the hardest thing because parts of my heart had always been filled with poetry and romance and love, and I wanted to share it all with her and learn from her. The challenges for country boys were great. I could not simply forget my past and discard my family for the sake of marriage. I couldn't forget my family's hard work, love, and encouragement. I reminded myself that I needed to appreciate their sacrifices instead of concerning myself with the disadvantages of having been born a country boy. After the revolution in 1979, I married a girl from the city. We were both revolutionaries. I was hoping that the spirit of the so-called borderless revolution would remove the existing city-country barriers and unite us as two human beings. Instead, the differences and barriers ran very deep and have always been trying to tear us apart. Similar cultural problems also arose in my political life with my colleagues after the revolution. Some city revolutionaries who called themselves freedom supporters started to mistreat or mock those of us who were from villages. They said to the public, "Look at the riders of the donkeys who aim to lead a nation." They meant that only their seemingly civilized compatriots, those who rode horses, would be able to run the country. It was painful to endure such discrimination at the time, but that experience brought joy to me years later when I read the story of the King of Kings, who entered Jerusalem on a humble donkey and did not worry about what those who claimed to be civilized thought. As a student, I worked hard to rescue myself from the village and its unbearable lifestyle and from every other obstacle that I felt was hindering my progress. To help support schooling costs, as well as some family expenses, my stepbrother and I collected firewood to sell during those days we were not in school. We did this when it was not sowing or harvest time. At these times, no member of the family would have free time for anything other than farming. We spent hours and hours in a nearby forest. I would climb the trees, cutting the thicker branches for charcoal and thinner branches for firewood. We gathered as much as we could carry on our backs and also on our donkey. Our enterprising activities in the forest helped me to become a very skillful tree climber. I always stood upright, high in the trees on my bare feet, and fearlessly cut the branches with a sharp axe. My stepbrother was not good at climbing the trees. He preferred to do the groundwork. He would cut the fallen branches into short pieces so that we could carry them. We would take them home and lay the thicker pieces in a kiln in our yard for producing charcoal and sell the thinner branches for firewood. The money we made from selling charcoal was much better than what we made from selling firewood because we sold the coal directly to businessmen while the firewood was sold to individuals in the city. But we worked hard to do both because we needed every bit of income. We also had to prove to our father that we were hard-working children who did not want to burden the family. Despite our constant work, I was still able to maintain good grades in school. My mother and siblings always supported my desire for higher education. In my father's absence, they encouraged me to achieve my educational goals. Without their moral support and help, I would not have been able to survive my father's opposition. Sometimes I would think, if my father tried to prevent me from going to school, I would not obey him no matter what the cost. As the years passed, my father saw my success and eased his pressure on me to retreat from my studies.